That's bad.
So let's talk about building turbo kits for a second, okay? Because I get questions all the time. So I figured this might help some people when they try to Google stuff. But you always get those people that just don't Google anything and they just start asking you what size this, what that. Let's try to answer most of them here. So it is my opinion that turbos are one of the best ways to add power to your car. I'm not going to say the easiest because I think nitrous is probably the easiest. It's quite literally bolt-on if you just want to add a 150 shot. It doesn't really get much simpler than that. Probably closely behind that is a bolt-on supercharger, like a Pro Charger or maybe a Root style. I think those are probably both pretty simple. They don't require much fabricating. You don't have to change the exhaust system, things like that. So why do I think turbos is one of the best? Because it takes the best of both worlds of those. With a blower or a supercharger with boost, basically, it's generally, this isn't the case for everything, it is generally healthier for the engine. Because 9 times out of 10, it'll make the boost higher in the RPM. It's easier on the rods. It's easier on the rotating assembly. It doesn't just hit it hard. Of course, there's exceptions to that rule. There's exceptions to every rule. All right, so I'm speaking generally, especially with like a centrifugal unit like a Pro Charger. That just makes boost way up in the RPM, down low where you're going to be a lot easier to fold the rods. It's a lot easier on the engine. I've seen a lot of nitrous guys. I know one nitrous guy really well who will hit that button at like 3,500 RPM, and it scares me every time. But with nitrous, it's a lot easier to change your power level. If you need to add 100 horsepower, you just change the jets real quick. That takes 5 minutes. Changing the pulleys, depending on your setup, can be a pain in the butt. Some of those Pro Charger deals, like with the blower on the front, it's real hard to get the pulley off the back in a parking lot. So I think turbo bridges that gap of boost being easy on the engine and being able to turn the power up really quickly. Basically just the turn of a knob if you're a manual boost controller. Now I'm trying to keep what I'm saying very general because like I said, I get a lot of questions about this. So I'm trying to cover a little bit of each base. So let's say you're building your first turbo kit and you've never done one before. You got a lot of questions. There's a lot of things you're not aware of. Generally, turbo kits are very, very forgiving. If you're trying to make 600-700 horsepower with a turbo kit, literally just throw that thing together and it'll usually make the power. Once you start getting above 600, 700, 800 horsepower, there's more things you need to consider. But I have seen some really, really, really ugly and like just terrible turbo kits make over 500 horsepower. I'm talking turbo kits where the pipes are welded together on that sort of an angle, just one like slash cut into another, and it looks like it was just, they MIG welded like this, bubble gum everywhere. So like I said, turbo kits are very forgiving, but once you try to increase the efficiency of that, it starts to run out pretty quickly. Now real quick, I just want to touch on what engines you can or cannot turbocharge. Now it is, again, my opinion that when it comes to what engine you can turbocharge, any of them. Literally any of them. There might be some little like nuances or things you have to do with a specific engine, but generally an engine's an air pump, turbo's just going to put more air in it. I'm just saying that because I have actually had someone message me asking if they could turbocharge a big block. I'm not saying that to put them on blast or ridicule them or anything like that. I'm just saying if you don't know something, you don't know something. You know, everybody's experience level is different. Now, with that said, most of what I'm going to say is going to regard V8 engines. That's where 95% of my turbo experience comes from. I've had 2, I think, turbo 4-cylinders. Now, as far as some of the common problems I see, I would say the biggest thing is forgetting or not keeping in mind the purpose of your car. So whenever someone asks me to like work on their car or do something, 9 times out of 10, I'll ask them, what are you going to do with the car? Like, what is its purpose? Is it strictly a daily driver, street strip, full drag, things like that. Because that's going to heavily impact how things are done. Like the Fiero is different from the Cobra, is different from the Camaro. Looking at the Fiero real quick, first thing you notice, there's no intercooler. That's because this thing's going to be a daily driver that's going to see very low boost to keep the transmission safe. So this thing will see 5, maybe 7 pounds of boost. It's not going to get the air into the motor real hot, so we don't need an intercooler. If we start to see that the IATs get a little hot, we can richen it up. It'll be fine. 7 pounds of boost isn't going to hurt anything. We come over here to the Mustang, and I would say this is much more of a street strip kind of car. So it does have a bigger turbo, but it also has a full radiator, and it goes through an intercooler. Now, as far as intercoolers go, I would say you will almost always be better off with an intercooler. And I say almost because there are going to be instances where you're building a dedicated like drag or race car or something like that, and you don't want a lot of weight on the front. So you've got other things you can do. You can do meth injection. You can do, you can switch fuels. And believe it or not, intercoolers are actually pretty heavy. Like, let's look at the one I got on the 55 here. Now, this one I'd say is a pretty large intercooler, 4-inch core, 3-inch pipes in and out. And this one is probably 45 pounds. And if you're building a dedicated drag car, having 45 pounds basically on the farthest point forward on the car, it's really not ideal. And then another way to do that is an air-to-water tank. Now, that does the same thing as an air-to-air intercooler, except instead of air passing through it, it's cold water passing through it. And it'll probably weigh about similar, maybe a little more actually, but you can move the weight further back. So circling back to building the car for its purpose, let's talk about turbo size and piping size. So I again think we have 3 pretty good examples of cars and their purposes. This one, like I said earlier, is fun daily driver. This will probably be raced once just to see what it runs, and then once that curiosity is settled, never again. So this thing has a T76 turbo on it, which is pretty small for a medium displacement V8. This one's a 5.3 LS, which those can handle a lot bigger turbo. Actually, that'll kind of segue us over to this. This car is going to have a 5.3. Right now it's just getting mocked up, but this is a 88 millimeter precision turbo. That thing will make more power than this car is ever going to need. And then coming over here, this car is a lot more drag race oriented. This is an S400 frame turbo. This will make a lot more power than the Fiero. You can see kind of how things are mounted, how I have the support for the turbo here to help hold the weight, because turbos are very heavy. If you've never held one, turbos are very heavy. This thing's probably 50, 55 pounds. So like the car going over bumps and the weight of the turbo bouncing, it'll crack a lot of the welds and it'll make your turbo just fall off, start hanging by the oil lines. Not usually a good thing. So whenever you can, it's always a good idea to brace them in some form, even if it's like a bar welded to the flange and then mounted somewhere. Everything helps. Now, speaking of piping, as far as the diameter of the piping, it is real easy to go overkill and think that you need 3-inch piping from each side into the turbo to make 1,000 horsepower. That's not the case. You can make 1,000 horsepower with 2¼ inch piping all day. The biggest thing is just the efficiency of your setup. Generally, I'll use 2¼ 2½. I think 2½ is probably the most common, and it's small enough that you can fit it in a lot of tight spaces. I mean, if we look at this Huron Speed Turbo Kit for a second, I'm pretty sure this crossover here is 2¼ Now, that's obviously not saying that you're never going to need more than 2¼ or 2½. If you're on like a big block or something with a lot of cubic inches or a lot of RPM, you're moving a lot of air, obviously bigger piping is going to help. If you got a 500-inch motor running at 9,000 RPM, yeah, 2¼ or 2½ is probably going to become a restriction pretty quickly. But again, if you've got a 500-inch motor running at 9,000 RPM, it's probably ain't a video you're going to watch. So I'm going to make a pretty broad statement here and say that 99% of the time, 2¼ or 2½ inch exhaust tubing will do everything you'll need it to. Now, wastegates. How many do we need? Where do we need them? That depends on how your setup is made. A lot of times, it's all going to come down to your chassis, your fitment, how you can route things. There's only so much you can get away. If you're trying to keep air conditioning, you're going to have to go around that. There's a lot of variables. But I tend to try to only have one wastegate on my setup. I think it's easier to only control one gate. If you can put it after the merge in pretty good flow priority, that's always perfect. What I mean by flow priority is the airflow coming from the engine into the turbo can flow into the wastegate really easily. Now, if we look at this turbo kit, I would say that wastegate has pretty decent flow priority. The piping curves right towards it, and a pretty good amount of air is going to be able to get vented out through that. If we come over here again and look at the Fiero, how that wastegate is set up, this is coming right off of a bend. You can see that the piping is angled more into the wastegate than it is to the turbo, so the wastegate has full priority there. That's almost as good as I could get for wastegate priority on this thing. Now, what does bad wastegate priority look like? That I can actually show you pretty easily. Here is a wastegate. Here, we'll just use this car as an example real quick. So you can see that the air is coming this way. This would be good wastegate priority. This would be terrible wastegate priority. There's almost no possible way for the air to get into the wastegate and vent out. You see what I mean? Hopefully I'm explaining that. So the air is coming this way, right? So the air will naturally want to hug the outside of this radius. That's just centrifugal force, right? So if you put the wastegate this way, the air is going to want to keep going that way. If you put the wastegate pointing this way, there's no way the air can do that like 120-degree turn. That is what most people in the industry would call bad. Now let's move on to the wastegate of the charge pipe, the blow-off valve. Blow-off valves are both very similar to wastegates and complete opposites because they don't follow that rule. You don't need priority for a blow-off valve. You can put that in stupid spots because the charge pipe will be pressurized. So all you got to do is just have a leak in that charge pipe somewhere to bleed off that pressure when you snap the throttle close. You can see I have this one a complete 90-degree to the charge pipe. That would be pretty terrible priority, but it doesn't matter because once the throttle's closed, this sees vacuum, pulls that diaphragm open. The boost that's in this pipe will just go, poof, it'll pop out of there. I could put this thing at an angle like this, and it would still work just fine. Well, I could have this thing come all the way around like that, like completely wrap around the pipe. It would look maybe kind of neat, but it would still work. It's incredibly amusing to me how wastegates and blow-off valves are incredibly similar in that they are both a vacuum-sourced diaphragm that controls and vents off pressure, basically. And one absolutely needs priority, and the other one, it doesn't matter at all. Now, as far as blow-off valves, do you need them? I will say need, no. Want, most often, yes. There are some exceptions where you're not going to need them. Now, I will say that if you are up in the air about whether you should put one on or not, you might as well just do it. Now, there are some people that say that without a blow-off valve, you will absolutely grenade your turbo and you'll bend your throttle blade. I don't think that's true. I think that the anti-surge compressors on turbos nowadays are super good that most larger frame turbos can handle it. Especially if you are an aware enough driver to not just snap the throttle close. If you can kind of just let off easy, I think it'll be fine. But like I said, if you're on the fence about it, just add one. All it's going to do is just prolong the life of your parts. Now, since I'm looking at it and thinking about it, charge piping size, I usually like to use 3-inch for pretty much anything. I think it's just, one, I do a lot of this stuff, so it's handy to have a bunch of parts laying around. But stuff like the Fiero, I probably could have gotten away with 2.5-inch, but like I said, I just like to use 3-inch. There's not generally a downside to having slightly bigger charge pipes than you'll need, but there's definitely a downside to having too small of a charge pipe. There's people making over 1,000 horsepower with 3-inch charge pipes. I'm pretty sure there's people making close to 1,500 horsepower with 3-inch charge pipes. So something like this, where it's going straight turbo to intake, I think that 3-inch charge pipe will support tons and tons of power. But if it was a deal where the piping has to come all the way through here, all the way around, doing this, a bunch of turns, that limit probably drops, you know what I mean? Here's a good example of that. This car is doing exactly what I just said. There's a bend off the turbo, a bend around the bumper to the intercooler, a bend over here, another bend, a bend up, a bend down, a bend into the intake. There's a bunch of bends on this. So instead of 3-inch, this has 3.5 that I really need to get a throttle body for so I can get this pipe made and be done with that. I don't know if I talked about turbo location. Turbo location, generally, it's going to be dictated by your chassis, just wherever you can put it. If you're willing to cut things, you can put it pretty much wherever you want. I know people who have it in the bed of their truck. Obviously, MAK's Gap Train and Sherm-Baker's Step Aside, those both have turbos in the bed. And if you're drag racing, you don't have to worry about the lag. You get on trans brake, build the boost. It'll be fine. If you're trying to roll race, might not be the best situation for you. If you're just trying to be cool and different, fuck it, put them outside the car somewhere. All right, so we talked about mounting the turbo, we talked about piping size, we talked about wastegates, blow-off valves. What's left? We could talk about exhaust and why so many people run exhaust for turbos out the bumpers. That is often due to packaging. A lot of these bigger turbos have pretty big exhaust flanges on them. This one, for example, has a 5-inch exhaust flange. So trying to get a 5-inch pipe all the way under the back of the car into the back is going to be either impossible or very expensive. Sure, you can get oval pipe and do a bunch of weird stuff, split it off. That's where it starts to get expensive. And if you do that, there have been a lot of dyno tests to show. I'm sure a lot of you guys watch Engine Masters and you watch their test. The more pipe you add off of a turbo, the less power it will make. The difference in something like this, where the piping just goes down and out the bumper, versus a full exhaust, could be 60, 70 horsepower. Like, they kill a lot of power. But again, that is all personal preference. Sure, you could easily put a loud valve or a dump valve or something on it to run it to a full exhaust, and then when you're in boost or when you want, you hit the switch or vacuum or something, and it opens the valve straight pipe. That's all up to you. I don't really care to do that, because I think that most of the time turbo cars aren't that loud. The turbo itself is more of a muffler than I think a lot of you guys give it credit for. Turbo cars are generally pretty darn quiet. I remember when we were swapping jack over from nitrous big block to turbo LS, and I punched a hole in the fender on this side. My dad was like, man, that thing's gonna be so loud, just droning in my ear the whole time. And even with the window down, cruising, we can have a conversation in the truck and it's fine. The only time they're really loud is when you're full throttle hammering it. When you're just sitting there idling, they're not that loud, man. So yeah, that's really why a lot of times they're just punched out a fender or out the hood or something like that. Is I mean, even a 4-inch one, try fitting a 4-inch pipe under your car to where it's not gonna hit anything. You can go over bumps without it bottoming out, stuff like that. Like, it's doable. Don't get me wrong, it's totally doable. It's just not worth it to a vast majority of people. Plus, if you're going to put all the time into turboing a car and fabricating stuff and things like that, 9 times out of 10, you don't want it to sound like every other car on the road. You want people to know that you put in all the effort and time and money, you know? Plus, it just looks freaking cool seeing flames come out the bumper. So, fuel system, again, like everything else we've talked about, is going to be dictated by your setup. I'm not going to tell you need a fuel system for 3,000 horsepower with like a crank-driven fuel pump if you're something like the Fiero. That just has a single in-tank 450. So I think usually you can get away with a lot with a single 450. I know 2 separate people who run dual in-tank 450s, and they've gone very fast. If you want an external pump, you can go dual AEM 400s. Those will support a ton of power. If you want a single pump, we put the MagnaFuel, what is it, the 4303, I think? Don't quote me. I think that's what we have on jack, and that'll support a bunch of power. I like to use at least 8 AN lines for the feed. If it's something that I know I'm going to want to turn up later, I'll put a 10 AN line on it, and that usually on 85 will support a bunch of power. It is always a good idea to get a vacuum reference fuel pressure regulator, and what that's going to do, if you don't know, when the engine starts to make boost, it'll send that boost pressure into the regulator. So with every pound of boost, it adds a pound to the fuel pressure. So if you have a base fuel pressure of, let's just say hypothetically 10 pounds, easy math, you have a base fuel pressure of 10 pounds and you're adding 10 pounds of boost, that'll increase the fuel pressure to about 20 pounds. It just keeps things nice and happy and keeps them safe. Now with the EFI cars, what I like to do, because there's the debate on what base fuel pressure you should run, if you want 58 or if you want 43. I used to be a 58 believer, but I quickly learned that 58 with 12 pounds of boost becomes 70. And that wears pumps out pretty quickly, for at least the pumps I was buying. If you turn that down to 43, That 12 pounds gets you up to 55 pounds, which is less than the stock pressure, so you can flow a lot of fuel. The harder you make pumps work, the less efficient they become. I'm trying to remember everything else I've been asked before. Oil feed and drain lines. So for the oil feed, you just want a 4AN line from wherever you can get a clean oil source. On an LS, for example, the bottom side by the oil filter, there's a little thing you can drill and tap and get your oil from there. No problem. Works perfect. And then for the drain, you want at least a 10AN that travels downhill all the way from the turbo to the oil pan. You don't want it to come up like that where oil can pool in this section and then it'll get backed up into the turbo. It'll start blowing past the seals, and then you'll wonder why you look like a diesel truck trying to take off every time you get in the gas. If you are in a situation like this where the turbo is pretty low in the chassis, you can get what's called a oil scavenge pump, which those are like $70 for a cheap one on Amazon. You can pay as much as $300 for one. And basically all that is just a little 12-volt pump that will pull the oil out of the turbo and push it into the pan. I'm trying to cover a lot of stuff that isn't directly related to LSs, because I know that not everybody likes LSs. And truth be told, I know this is going to shock a lot of people. I don't think the LS is the best engine there is. I'll hold for the gasps. I don't think it's the best engine. I think that as far as making power and not spending a ton of money, I think it is one of the best options. But I think as far as just strictly best engine, that's probably... Hi. What I meant to say was the LS is best engine
ever made. Have a good day.